Thank you. Thank you so much, Joel, and thank you, Erica. This is an extraordinary pleasure. I've been speaking recently on college campuses. You know what that means. I've received the walkout, the storm the stage, and at Claremont McKenna College, the blockade that prevented anybody from entering to hear me speak. So this is actually a very unusual experience for me to have an audience still in its seats and seemingly prepared to hear me out. So it's going to take me a few moments to adjust to an audience. But I've also received the preemptive cancellation from a little company here in Mountain View that some of you perhaps have heard of. A few months ago, I was contacted by a Google employee who was reaching out to see if I'd be willing to speak at Google about my book, The War on Cops. And of course, I said yes. And I didn't hear anything back for weeks and months. It went on. And finally, he wrote back and he said, on further reflection, it would put me at too great professional and personal risk to send your name further up the decision-making ladder to bring you here. So this makes me even more grateful to be at the Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley, where I can see what you guys are up against. So what was I trying to say that was so violently unacceptable to students and their faculty enablers, and that it elicited so cowardly a response from the Silicon Valley elite? I was going to say at Claremont, at UCLA, at Berkeley, that there is no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black lives matter than the police, and that there is a huge, unacknowledged wellspring of support for the police in inner city neighborhoods. For that, I've been called, in one student petition at Pomona College, quote, a fascist, white supremacist, war hawk, transphobe, queerphobe, classist, and ignorant of, that's their grammar, not mine, interlocking systems of domination that produce the lethal conditions under which oppressed people are forced to live, end quote. But enough about me. Let's talk about the police. Of all the things shaken by the earthquake of November 8th, the question of our current policing and crime climate is one of the most important. The intense anti-police agitation of the last 3 years had an unquestionable role in the election's outcome, which I'm sure there's diverse opinions in this room, but we're not going to get into that specifically. I'm going to offer some speculation about the future regarding crime and policing under Trump administration. But first, I want to talk about the present and the immediate past to understand how we got here. In a word, law and order is breaking down in inner cities. When cops get out of their car to conduct a routine pedestrian stop to ask questions of that guy hanging out on a known drug corner at 1 a.m., hitching up his waistband as if he has a gun, they find themselves routinely surrounded by hostile, jeering crowds, cursing at them, sometimes throwing things at them. I was asked to address the Fugitive Task Force of New York, New Jersey, of the U.S. Marshals Service. These are the guys who are tasked with finding the most violent felon absconders, people that even the big bad New York Police Department can't handle. And a black cop, black marshal, got up from the back of the room and he said to me, I want to tell you what happened to me a couple weeks ago. One of the reasons that they'd invited me to speak to them. He said, I was trying to arrest a violent felon on White Plains Road in the North Bronx, and I was immediately surrounded by 23 people cursing at me. One guy picked up a pike and threatened to kill him. He only got out of that situation by calling for backup, and 2 cars arrived. A Chicago cop last June told me he has never experienced so much hatred in his 19 years on the job. He said it's basically an undoable job now. An emergency service worker in the Bronx was trying to free a woman who'd been pinned under her car following a car accident. And a guy crossed the yellow tape, the accident scene, walked right up to the cop and stuck the cell phone, the inevitable cell phone, in the officer's face, who said, "Please, sir, get back up onto the sidewalk. This is an accident scene." And he said, as is typical today, "You can't make me do that." So why is this happening? It's because a false narrative about policing has taken over the national discourse. That narrative holds that the police are the greatest threat facing young black men today, and that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of black men. Now, that narrative, of course, is most associated with the Black Lives Matter movement and its media enablers, but it was amplified by President Barack Obama at virtually every opportunity. Last July, 3 hours before 5 cops were assassinated in Dallas by an assassin inspired by Black Lives Matter movement, President Obama thought it was so important to reiterate this message that he took time off from a diplomatic delegation to Poland and spieled off a litany of statistics that he thought proved that the police were systemically racist. And one of them was that blacks are arrested at twice the rate of whites. Well, I've never heard of that particular statistic, but I'm willing to concede it to him. Keep it in mind, because I'm going to return to it later. But after those 5 cops were assassinated, President Obama had the gall to go to the memorial service for the officers in Dallas and repeat his same theme. And he said that black parents were right to fear that their child could be killed by a cop every time they go out onto the street merely for doing something stupid. Now, if you make such a statement, you better be damn sure that it's accurate, because it profoundly delegitimates our criminal justice system, and with it the moral basis for government itself. It is exactly such claims that are inflaming the hatred against the cops that they're encountering on a daily basis now. So is it true that policing is lethally racist? It is false. Virtually everything the public thinks it knows about policing, crime, and race from the Black Lives Matter movement is wrong. Reverse it, and you have the truth. Now, let me state at the onset, every shooting, every police shooting of an unarmed civilian is a stomach-churning tragedy, and the cops have to work incessantly to make sure that such grotesque miscarriages of justice don't happen. And given this country's appalling history of racism and the complicity of the cops in maintaining both slavery and a jury segregation through the use of brutal and often unlawful force, every police shooting of a black man is particularly and understandably fraught. And there have been some bad police shootings over the last 3 years. But they are a minute percentage. They are not representative of policing today. It is fitting that Michael Brown, the teenager who was shot in Ferguson, Missouri in August of 2014, setting off the Black Lives Matter movement, it is fitting that he's continually regarded as a martyr to police brutality by the Black Lives Matter movement, because just as the entire hands up, don't shoot narrative that was fomented by the phony bystanders was a hoax, so is the entire Black Lives Matter movement a fraud. Now, on this lovely Bay Area gorgeous evening, after a working day or after a day of just enjoying the live oaks and the eucalyptus, which I've been doing, I don't want to burden you with statistics. But I'm afraid if we're going to deconstruct the Black Lives Matter movement, we're going to have to look at some numbers. So please bear with me. In 2015, the police fatally shot 991 civilians, the vast majority armed and dangerous. Is that too many? I don't know. And nobody's ever proposed what the proper number should be. The police have about 385 million contacts with citizens a year. In 2014, they made over 11 million arrests. Deadly weapons assaults against officers occur 27 times a day in just 2/3 of the nation's police jurisdictions. For every 10 deadly weapons assaults against a police officer, the cops fatally shoot one person. Now, is that too high a ratio? Again, I don't know. But nobody in the Black Lives Matter movement has ever proposed what a proper ratio should be. Now, of those 991 victims of fatal police shootings in 2015, 50% were white and 26% were black. If the media focused exclusively on white victims of fatal police shootings, the public would think we were living through an epidemic of biased police shootings of white men. Instead, many people are under the impression that the only people that the cops shoot are black. Last July, the head of the Congressional Black Caucus stood up in Congress and said, well, as we all know, the vast majority of people shot by the police fatally this year have been black. Well, as of that moment, 51% of all police shooting victims had been white, and 27% had been black. Now, among the nearly 500 white victims of fatal police shootings in 2015 was a 50-year-old man in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in a domestic violence incident who ran at the officer with a spoon, a 28-year-old driver in Des Moines, Iowa, who led the police on a chase, then got out of his car and walked quickly towards the officer, and a 21-year-old on a bike in Akron, Ohio, who'd been involved in a grocery store robbery and didn't take his hand out of his waistband when ordered to do so by the cop. The public at large has never heard of their cases because they don't fit the prevailing narrative. Had their victims been black, however, we would have heard about them and undoubtedly added them to the roster of victims of police racism. In fact, a greater percentage of white and Hispanic homicide victims are killed by the cops than black homicide victims. Fully 12% of all whites and Hispanics who die of homicide are killed by a police officer, compared to 4% of black homicide victims who are killed by a police officer. So if we're going to have an anti-cop Lives Matter movement, it would actually make more sense to call it white and Hispanic Lives Matter. Now, what about that 26 to 27% black share of victims of fatal police shootings? Does that show police racism? After all, blacks are 13% of the nation's population, so you have a 2-to-1 disparity there. It does not. The relevant benchmark for police activity is not population ratios, but crime activity. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this evening, it's to be on the lookout for the sleight of hand that goes on in our national discourse when they're talking about police and they're talking about race. They will inevitably be comparing police activity to population ratios, not crime. But policing today is data-driven. It goes where people are being victimized, and that is sadly in minority neighborhoods. In the 75 largest counties of the United States, which is where most of the population resides, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is the nation's premier agency for collecting crime data, blacks commit 2/3 of all violent crime in those 75 largest counties, even though they're 15% of the population there. Blacks commit homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined, and 11 times the rate of whites. This is an uncomfortable thing to talk about, and I'm sorry to have to do it. But if we're going to talk about policing and race and be talking about police bias, we're going to have to get into a topic that has been taboo for 3 decades. These disparities are repeated in virtually every big city. In New York City, blacks commit 75% of all shootings. How do we know that? That's what the victims of and witnesses to those shootings tell the police. This is not the allegedly racist NYPD that is fiddling with the numbers. These are the victims and witnesses who are predominantly minority themselves. Blacks commit 75% of all shootings, though they're 23% of the population. If you add Hispanic shootings to black shootings in New York City, you account for 98% of all illegal shootings. Whites are 34% of the population. They commit less than 2% of all shootings. This is absolutely typical. Oakland, it's the same thing. Whites are about 34% of the population. They commit less than 1% of all shootings and homicides, and blacks commit about 80%. In Chicago, whites and blacks are each a little under 1/3 of the city's population. Again, blacks commit about 80% of shootings and 80% of murders. Whites, 1 to 2%. Again, I apologize for bringing these things up, but all we've been hearing about is police racism. The police do not wish these disparities. It's a reality forced upon them by the reality of crime. But it means that virtually every time the cops are called out on a shots fired call, meaning somebody has been shot, they're going to be called to minority neighborhoods on behalf of minority victims. And if anybody for once is cooperating with the police, being given a description of a minority suspect, the cops hope against hope that for once in a drive-by shooting, they'll be given a description of a white suspect, and it virtually never happens. Now, that disparity has implications for officer use of force, because that's going to occur where officers are most often confronting violent, armed, and resisting suspects, and that is overwhelmingly in minority neighborhoods. Blacks are actually shot less than their crime rates would predict. Last year, 4 studies came out from academia and from actually, amazingly, one anti-cop activist group called the Center for Policing Activity that all reached the same conclusion. There is either no bias in police shootings, or if there is a bias, it works in favor of blacks and against whites. Hard to get your mind around that. Can't be right, right? Because it's so against everything we've been taught to believe, but it is true. And those crime rates have an implication for every other type of policing, not just fatal shootings. Remember the Obama pre-Dallas statistic about blacks being arrested at twice the rate of whites. Okay, let's put on our benchmark hats and think, what's he doing there? Twice the rate of whites. He's using a population benchmark. When you consider that blacks commit homicide at 11 times the rate of whites, robbery and shooting rates are even more disparate, we shouldn't be surprised at a 2-to-1 arrest ratio. But however false, this dominant narrative about systemic police bias is having an enormous effect on policing and crime. Cops are being told relentlessly by CNN, by MSNBC, by the New York Times, by the San Francisco Chronicle, by the Washington Post, that they are racist for going where people are being victimized and trying to bring order to that neighborhood through pedestrian stops, the so-called Stary stops, stop, question, frisk, if any of you have been to law school, or broken windows policing, the low-level public order enforcement saying, you guys are trespassing, you're hanging out on a corner, drinking, urinating, please get off the corner. Cops are being told that's racist. Well, policing is political. And if they get the message long enough that a certain type of enforcement is unacceptable, they're going to do less of it. And that's, in effect, how it should work. So officers today are doing much less of the type of policing that leads to crime drops. Last year in Chicago, pedestrian stops dropped 82% on top of the previous year's already huge drop in proactive policing. Officers are simply driving by suspicious behavior. They don't have to make those stops. They continue to run to 911 calls with alacrity. That's the essential, mandatory aspect of policing. But there's a whole universe of policing that is purely discretionary. That's what's referred to as proactive. When officers use their powers of observation, see something suspicious, and get out and ask a few questions. And that is the type of policing that is under such attack today. An LAPD officer that works in Watts said, guys and gals in coffee shops, the cops, are telling each other, you'd have to be crazy to get out of your car and make that stop. If something goes wrong or if you have to use force and you're caught on YouTube, your career's over. So they're driving on by. What happens when officers back off of proactive policing in high crime areas? Crime goes through the roof. In 2015, the nation saw the largest one-year increase in homicide in nearly 50 years, 12%. Cities with large black populations saw an even greater increase, from 54% in Washington, D.C. to 73% in Milwaukee to a whopping 90% in Cleveland. In September of 2015, 3 children in Cleveland under the age of 8 were killed in drive-by shootings, leading the police chief there, who happens to be black, to break down in tears and say, everybody's out there protesting. When the cops kill one of us, why don't we ever protest when we kill each other? Now, I've called this combination of depolicing and the resulting emboldening of criminals the Ferguson Effect. And I've elicited howls of protest among criminologists. But all the data that's come out since I first proposed this theory, I have to say, without tooting my own horn, have proven me absolutely right. And Chicago, again, is the primary example of the Ferguson Effect. Recall stops there last year dropped 82%. Last year in Chicago, 4,300 people were shot. 1 person every 2 hours. They were overwhelmingly black. They included a 3-year-old boy who was shot on Father's Day, who's now paralyzed for life. 10-year-old Tavon Tanner, who was shot on Labor Day. The bullet ripped through his kidneys, intestines, and spleen. And overall, 24 children under the age of 12 who were shot. Now, since these victims were overwhelmingly black, 4,300 people, you would assume, given what President Obama told us, that black parents are right to fear that their kids can be shot by the cops. And if you believe Black Lives Matter movement, you'd think, boy, those Chicago cops have been really busy shooting all those black people. In fact, last year, the Chicago cops shot 21 people, virtually all armed or dangerous. That's 0.5% of the total. Imagine if 4,300 white people had been shot. There'd be a revolution in the streets. It's unthinkable. The media thinks of itself as such a social justice warrior. In fact, it doesn't give a damn about black lives unless they're taken by a cop, because those 4,300 shootings are completely off stage. Now, something else happens when the cops back off of proactive policing, and that's that the good people, the millions of law-abiding people in inner city areas, find their requests and needs ignored. Go to any inner city police community meeting, as I do all the time, and you're going to hear some variant of the following three requests. A, you arrest the drug dealers and they're back on the corner the next day. Why can't you keep them off the street? B, there's kids hanging out on the corner by the hundreds, fighting. They're beating up on young girls. Whatever happened to truancy laws? Whatever happened to loitering laws? Why can't you do something about it? And the poor police commander has to get up there and say, well, the Supreme Court sort of took away our loitering enforcement powers. Or C, I'm terrified to go out onto the street because the kids are hanging out there. I spoke to an elderly cancer amputee in the Mount Hope section of the Bronx who said to me, please, Jesus, send more police. Because the only time she feels safe to go into her building lobby to get her mail was when the cops were there, because the lobby was otherwise colonized by trespassing youth, hanging out, smoking weed, and selling drugs. This is a reality that people in this room do not experience. And most of us don't really know it's going on because the media doesn't want to talk about it. But when the police back off of proactive policing from that public order enforcement because the media tells them they're racist, it's people like Mrs. Sweeper who suffer. But officers today are also at risk thanks to this Black Lives Matter narrative. They're second-guessing themselves when it comes to the use of lawful force. A retired police commander, deputy chief in San Francisco, Jim Dudley, told me that cops today are making up new techniques on the fly for taking down resisting suspects because they're so worried about the cell phone video. The public doesn't have a clue how hard it is to take down a guy who's determined to resist arrest. It can take 6 cops. And officer use of force is never pretty. We're a very pacific society now. We're not used to seeing things like that. And so they're trying to figure out ways to get this guy down that's not going to look so bad, however lawful their use of force is on a cell phone video. They're second-guessing themselves to the point of putting themselves at enormous risk. Last October in Chicago, there was a car chase, and the guy in the passenger seat got out and started running, and the cops eventually caught up with him. But he grabbed a female officer and started beating her head into the asphalt and ripping out huge handfuls of her hair. Knocked her unconscious, and when she finally came to in the hospital, she told Chicago Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson that the reason she hadn't used her gun, even though she was patently justified in doing so, was that she was so worried that there'd be a cell phone video and she'd become the latest racist cop of the week on the endless CNN video loop, and her family and the police department itself would come under criticism. Last year, gun murders of officers rose 53%, thanks to this phony narrative, and assaults on officers have risen too. Even before last year, with its massive increase in cop killings, a police officer was 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a police officer. So that's a disparity, again, we do not hear about. But we're at risk, if this depolicing and Ferguson effect continues, of losing the 2 decades-long crime drop that this nation has enjoyed starting from the early 1990s, when a policing revolution that began in New York City under lamented Rudolph Giuliani, data-driven policing spread nationwide. If we continue having double-digit crime increases, and it looks like 2016 we're going to get another one, another double-digit homicide increase, that 50% violent crime drop since the mid-1990s is going to go away. But we're at risk of losing something even more important than our public safety, and that's civil peace. Riots have been returning to the urban landscape. There's not a single law enforcement practice that isn't under attack as racially biased, whether it's warrant enforcement, traffic enforcement, bail, anything, you name it. Departments are on the defensive now. We've had Prop 47 in California, realignment to AB 109, all trying to downgrade offenses. Why? It's all because of the race issue. The perception is if there's more minority men in prison, it must be because of racism rather than crime. So what happens now? Well, the most important thing that Trump can do is to change the narrative. The reach of federal policy when it comes to local crime and policing is actually quite limited, and I think it's more limited than Trump himself understands. The feds actually muck things up as much as they fix them, and I know there's some police officers in the room, and I bet they'd agree with me on that. Nevertheless, we can be very grateful. I'll give you another set of reasons why we should be grateful that Hillary Clinton didn't win. She would have continued these federal consent decrees that the Obama Justice Department slapped on police departments at an unprecedented rate, that take needed officers off the street to fill out onerous, draconian paperwork. She would have strong-armed departments into providing implicit bias training, which is a complete waste of time. Cops are desperate for more hands-on tactical training that will allow them to make those excruciating split-second shoot-don't-shoot decisions, that will allow them to understand to use cover, and yes, to de-escalate through verbal judo. But implicit bias training is completely ridiculous because, as I mentioned, if there's a bias in police shootings, it works in favor of blacks and against whites. But worse, she would have continued the same rhetoric that she'd embraced during the campaign that was doubling down on Obama, calling police systemically racist. So the absence of an echo chamber in the White House for the Black Lives Matter falsehoods should give the police at least a fighting chance to curb the rising violence of the last 2 years, although it doesn't seem to have happened quite yet. Sadly, the Black Lives Matter movement is not going to go quietly into the night. It may even grow more extreme, fueled by a university culture that is obsessively devoted to racial victimology. Hate-filled chants like the one current on the streets of Chicago, CPD, that stands for Chicago Police Department, CPD, KKK, how many kids did you kill today? Those chants will continue to be hurled at officers. But while the media and all of academia will continue to amplify such lies, at least our current president will not. The ironies of this election when it came to public safety have been many. Trump was the only candidate among the final two contenders who actually expressed concern about the rising death toll in black communities and was promptly called a racist for doing so. Go figure. But if he succeeds in his pledge to, quote, fix our inner cities, it will mean first and foremost honoring the desire of the millions of law-abiding residents there for assertive and respectful police protection. Thank you for your attention.
How can the media ignore the breakdown of the black family and the absentee father?
You've hit on the cause. That is it. And they ignore it. Why? Because to say that fathers matter today is one of the most politically incorrect taboos you can break. Because men are being disappeared. You upset the notion that strong women can do it all. And now with same-sex marriage, you're also allegedly dissing the lesbian couple. Now, there are many single mothers that are raising law-abiding young males, and they're working heroically against the odds and succeeding. But their odds are against them. And what you have now in the inner city is a social catastrophe where you have nationally the out-of-wedlock birth rate among blacks is 73%. In places like Milwaukee or south side of Chicago, it's about 85%. Marriage has virtually disappeared. And the fact of the matter is that on average, mothers and fathers are different. They bring different skills to work, and children, raising a child is hard enough as it is with two parents. Doing it with one is really, really difficult. And you can talk to men in prison, and they'll say, I needed my father. But again, men are they and police generally are sort of the legitimate targets of opprobrium these days, and it is just impossible to talk about it. The media is wedded to the myth of pervasive white racism, and they would rather talk about that.
This is a little enjoyable. It goes back to my introduction. Someone wants to know, were you ever able to get the ear of Jerry Brown? Did you ever get a hold of him?
Oh yeah, he called me. He wanted to tell me about all of his wonderful criminal reform work, and but he wanted me also to take on the judicial litigation, the vise of the three-judge panel of our prison system. And there he was right. I mean, Brown gets that consent decrees are just a disaster for institutions, and I did write about that. It's actually in my book. So Brown is such a mixed bag. I mean, as mayor in Oakland, he's spoke up for the police, but he didn't really do much, and so he's unfortunately gone more and more left over the years.
Have you seen any changes come out of the Trump administration yet? And if so, what, in this regard of policing, obviously? And if not, what do you think they will be done in the future?
No, it's been very, very positive. Jeff Sessions is so great. I haven't brought up like one of the biggest travesties today, which is sanctuary cities, the most grotesque violation of the rule of law. But Sessions has been fabulous on that. And on policing specifically, he has changed the rhetoric. He said, of course, policing has to be constitutional, it has to be respectful, but we support the cops. And he has called for a review of the federal consent decree process. And he wanted, this is the most weird thing. In the last week of the Obama administration, the Obama Justice Department slapped a federal consent decree on Baltimore police. Baltimore now has its highest per capita homicide rate in its history, thanks to the Ferguson Effect. And their consent decree that they worked out makes it virtually impossible to do that type of public order, broken windows policing that the good people in those communities are desperate for. And so this was finalized. Jeff Sessions said to the judge, okay, you still have to sign it. Could I please have 90 days to review this consent decree? Well, what happened? You would think that a police chief and a mayor would say, thank you, Jeff Sessions. We don't want to have to spend $10 million a year on a grotesquely overpaid federal monitor when we are struggling with our highest crime rate in history. Instead, the police chief said, don't you dare free me from federal control. And the mayor said that as well. And the judge slapped down Sessions, and now they've got a federal consent decree. The politics of it are bizarre, but Chicago, Obama Justice Department lawyers, to their utter chagrin, were unable to finalize that consent decree until, Trump finally got inaugurated. And initially Rahm Emanuel was saying, but I want a federal consent decree, I want a federal consent decree. Now he sort of said, well, we can maybe do it without a federal judge, and there's a huge protest there. But Sessions has definitely changed it. I've been telling them, you got to do a study of benchmarking, figure out a benchmark, and for heaven's sake, do everything you can to get rid of the disparate impact analysis, which is what's driving so much of this, that even if a government practice and a private employment practice or a police practice is not discriminatory or intentionally racist, if it has a disparate impact on any blacks, it's viewed as racist. Well, sorry to say, but most criminal laws have a disparate impact on blacks. I mean, we should get rid of our homicide laws if that's our criterion. So I'm hoping that that'll be the next step under Sessions, but he's really great.
I always enjoy it when there seems to be a commingling of minds and several questions, which are really the same question, but written by different people. So very thoughtfully, it seems like people are trying to do this on their own. One statement was, if we try to discuss this with others, they blame poverty and guns. Please help us with a good response. And outside of the numbers, obviously, that's a little hard to describe in a conversation, but something like that. And related to that, your points are very well taken, data-driven, logical, but lefties are impervious to this.
Yes.
And what can we say? Is there some magic combination of words that get people to see?
Well, again, like I try and give voice to those law-abiding residents of minority neighborhoods, black, who want the police. I mean, what are we supposed to do? The Black Lives Matter toll, we can quantify it. 900 more black males were shot in 2015 compared to the previous year because of the Ferguson Effect, bringing the black homicide toll in 2015 to 7,000. Let's put that in context. That's 2,000 more homicide victims of all whites and Hispanics combined. 5,000 whites and Hispanics were murdered compared to 7,000 blacks. Those black victims are overwhelmingly male. Black males are 6% of the population. So where's Black Lives Matter when it comes to those black victims? As far as the poverty excuse, the nation's biggest poverty event was the Great Depression. Our crime rates were virtually zero.
That's great.
The idea that it's poverty making these kids shoot each other in these insane drive-by shootings is ridiculous. The police's greatest friend today is social media. Every kid out there has a smartphone, and they're filming each other with their gang signals and bragging about their shootings. These are kids that have the latest sneakers. This is not poverty in any real sense. And there's, say, Asian immigrants living in these neighborhoods who have less of a household income. Their crime rates are negligible. Why? Parents. The Asian family is the most intact of any group in our country, and they are riding those kids mercilessly to study, do their homework, and respect their teachers, and that's what matters.
That's great. Good answer. So I had one question that's historical and one that's very current. I think they kind of go together. We'll put them together. There's someone in the audience that thought perhaps the beginning of this when President Obama met with Henry Gates and they had their beer summit, and that was historically now seems like a long time ago. Yeah. And then more recently, is there the incident with the assassination of the New York officer? Would this have any effect on Bill de Blasio?
Huh. Well, no, it didn't, because he immediately left the city to go to Hamburg, where the police were being targeted, by the dozens, if not hundreds. De Blasio has moderated his rhetoric a little bit. He ran on an anti-cop platform, and he anticipated Obama's statement about black parents being right to fear that their kids are going to be killed by a cop, because he said that his biracial son, he worries about him every day, that he'll be killed by a cop. Again, this is so statistically enumerate. The police in New York are not shooting Dante de Blasio. If Dante de Blasio is at risk, it's from people who look like him, frankly. The beer summit, you know what, it does seem like ages ago. I could have lived with that if Obama didn't double down on Black Lives Matter narrative. But in a sense, yes, it was a harbinger of what was to come, where he overlooked the fact that somebody in the residence where Henry Louis Gates, a Harvard professor, lived, had called the police to that house and said, something looks wrong here. It looks like somebody's trying to strong arm into the door, because Gates couldn't get himself in. And Obama, of course, immediately said, racialized it and said, you know, this is the cop acting stupid. So, you know, he didn't need to have jumped into that. But if it had ended at the beer summit, the damage was containable, but it got much, much worse.
So a different aside here of the problem, or potential problem, the police also get attacked by libertarians over the militarization of their departments. And is this something that we ought to be concerned about on a different side?
Interesting, good question. To me, the big problem there is knowing that the Pentagon procurement policies are so shoddy that they've got all this excess loot to get off their hands. You know, why are we paying for all this Pentagon procurement if you know, you have to sort of foist it off on departments? You know, I haven't looked into it. There's a guy, Radley Balco, if you follow it, that does claim that this is completely out of control and that there's all these no-knock warrants where the SWAT teams are knocking on houses incorrectly. I think it's, frankly, to be honest, it is a minor and marginal problem. The real issue today is what's happening in minority neighborhoods. That's street crime, drive-by shootings, and robberies. The no-knock warrants are not an issue. And the fact of the matter is, you know, they are, by and large, they're getting warrants, and the police departments do want this equipment in case of active shooter events. So I think it's somewhat of an obsession that is not really getting at the heart of the matter.
And we're going to cut our Q&A a little bit short tonight. Heather has an early flight in the morning, so we'll take a couple more. And
no, I have to swim tomorrow. That is the issue before I fly.
Yes,
so.
her day starts very early regardless of the flight, we'll put it that way. And we'll have time for people to get signed books. The nice people from Books Inc. are here over to the side, and Heather will be signing books when she's done here. This is sort of a little bit of a side. It's not police, but I found it interesting. How many homicides by legal gun owners, statistics, or any statistics on that, regarding maybe gun controlled and concealed carry? Your expertise may be police, but you have a thought of often justifiable shootings by legal gun owners.
Yeah, I don't know the data on that, and I think Bernie Sanders was right when he said early on in the campaign, noted that virtually everybody in Vermont owns a gun, and they have zero violent crime rate. So, you know, maybe it sounds kind of facile to say guns don't kill people, people do, but actually it's right. Switzerland is the same thing. Israel, it's the same thing. What is causing this is not guns per se. It's the breakdown of the family and the breakdown of social controls on these kids. You know, the police are the second best solution. It's not ideal, you know, to have the police having to maintain order, but when families are not doing so, when ordinary, informal social controls are breaking down, the police have to step in.
Then finally, do you have any information on the George Soros funding of Black Lives Matter? I hear about that.
Well, you know what? My response to that is always, it doesn't matter, because they've got the media. And George Soros, yes, he's providing training money, but frankly, I think that's a sideshow. And to pretend that this is all about George Soros, everybody wants a conspiracy theory and a clear villain to blame. It would be nice if that was the problem. The problem is that CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times are wedded to the anti-cop narrative, and they have a lot more influence than even Soros's millions can have.
Ladies and gentlemen, Heather MacDonald.
Thank you.
Okay.